form. Economy of expression is a major source of its strength. It is a story of which it might well be said, as Tolstoy said of Fyodor's stories, that, quote, every word calls forth a multitude of ideas, images and interpretations, unquote. The command of detail is uncanny. 5 years after she wrote it, Rebecca compared the story unfavourably with the visual image out of which it arose. Her doubt is understandable, but surely misplaced, for the story dramatically enlarges the significance of its visual origin, transforming an evocative image into a narrative of extraordinary imaginative energy. The picture of the leaping hare remains in the reader's mind long after the story is ended, but now it is charged with fresh meaning, derived from a distinctively literary imagination inspired by the visual image. Rebecca's story is written on one side of a large sheet of paper. The handwriting is extravagantly neat. There are no corrections and no revisions of the text. The immaculate appearance of the manuscript, Rebecca's first and final draft, reinforces the impression conveyed by the tightness of the narrative argument that this was a story fully formed in Rebecca's mind before she sat down to write. At the top of the page, she places her story's chosen title, apparently written down in advance of the tale itself, Girl Today, Hare Tomorrow. The ingenious title epitomizes the plot and its underlying significance. Here today, gone tomorrow runs the familiar proverb, signifying, as the Oxford English Dictionary puts it, that which is, quote, short-lived, merely transient. Rebecca's variation preserves the sound and rhythm of the original, but wittily reverses the initial letters of the proverb's two halves, in a manoeuvre that reinforces the revolutionary impact of her title. The linguistic conceit may be playful, but its purpose is deeply serious. Tolstoy, in describing the origin of his pupil's story, He feeds you with a spoon and pokes you in the eye with a handle, writes of how amongst his unrealized dreams he has imagined a series, quote, a series not so much of stories as of pictures written around proverbs. Rebecca goes further. Her story is intensely visual, but rather than illustrating the proverb, she reinvents it. If, as Walter Benjamin argues in The Storyteller, incidentally a wonderful essay for anyone who's interested in narrative of children or adults, if, as Walter Benjamin argues in The Storyteller, a proverb might be thought of as, quote, a ruin which stands on the site of an old story, Rebecca, we might say, writes a new story that at once revives and challenges the proverb's original meaning. The merely transient acquires a darker implication, the passing from one world to another. In thus recasting her proverbial source, Rebecca mimics the tale she has to tell. It is the story of a metamorphosis. How better than to open it with the metamorphosis of a proverb? As readers, we are immediately aware of the title's verbal play, but only the unfolding plot will clarify its sinister and subversive purpose. Saturday, June the 13th. The time was 7 p.m. The story begins with a date, as a letter might. This date is genuine. Saturday, June the 13th had just passed when Rebecca wrote her story. The choice of a historical date is no accident. A central concern of the story is the tension between reality and fantasy that so exercises Rebecca in her letter 5 years later. The world as we daily inhabit it is set against another way of being, the world into which Rebecca's heroine disappears. In her previous story, Dodecahedron, Rebecca had already begun to explore this tension. Girl Today, Hare Tomorrow sharpens it. The narrative opens not in a fabled village such as Minor, the setting in Dodecahedron, but in the all-too-familiar village of Harwell, here and now, at a precise historical moment. The opening directly challenges the convention of the folk tales once upon a time. Although Rebecca had avoided the traditional formula already in Dodecahedron, her narrative there had remained within the bounds of a purely imaginary time. Now she chooses to break these bounds by setting her new story in recorded time, a time that she will later describe as, quote, basically real memory. Dating the story is thus a way of emphasizing its historicity, paradoxical though that might seem. We are not to be witnesses to a fairy story. The tale, we are warned, is for real, whether or not we are able to recognize it as such. For the truth is, that reality is not as commonplace as we ordinarily suppose it in our uneventful lives, to borrow the word with which in her letter Rebecca chooses to describe shadowy Mr. Slatter. The real embraces both ways of being, fathers and daughters, the mundane and the miraculous, shadow and substance, as time and the tale will tell. As Rebecca explains, quote, I wanted the change really to happen. The folk tale is not abandoned then, like the proverb, like reality itself, it is redefined. Once date and time are established, the story can unfold. Rachel Slatter was going to be in a play called Alice. The name is intriguing. Wendy Slatter was Rebecca's best friend at school. By changing her first name to Rachel, Rebecca distances the reference while assimilating the name to her own, Rebecca Smalley. The fictional Rachel Slatter bears more resemblance to Rebecca than to Wendy, and Mr. Slatter is her own father, who is modelled on Rebecca's father rather than on Wendy's. It was her own father who owned a Citron family estate and had a mechanically minded friend named Pete, and the journey to Wantage begins on what is clearly her own front drive. These details are designed to enhance the story's verisimilitude, but their significance should not be misconstrued as implying the identification of Rebecca with the heroine of her story. In her letter, as you remember, Rebecca raises the possibility only to dismiss it when she says, whether the father's complete unconnection with the Hare and his daughter reflects my own view of parentage at the time, I'm not sure. More likely this is how I wanted Rachel to feel. I feel that's a very important point. We're in danger sometimes of reading children's stories as evidence of their own psychological state. That's a very dangerous procedure, in my view. The story is not to be read as one child's response to her own particular family situation. Its wisdom embraces a wider world of feeling. Some 3 or 4 years earlier, both Rebecca and Wendy had taken part in a scene in a school play based on the Mad Hatter's Tea Party from Alice's Adventures in Wonderland. Rebecca had played the Mad Hatter, Wendy the White Rabbit. Lewis Carroll's masterpiece was certainly an influence on this story, but less directly, I suspect, than Rebecca's memory of this play. The wonderland of Carroll's imagination is far removed from Rebecca's strange new world. Its function in the story is as much as anything to arouse suspicion, alerting a knowledgeable reader to the possibility of the fantastic. The play, on the other hand, lies at the story's heart. Playing and reality compose its theme. By the end, the world of the play will have turned into the heroine's real world, the world into which she disappears. Rachel Slatter becomes what she plays, while her father looks idly on. She got in the car with her father. It might seem that all is well as father and daughter set off together in the family car, their big Citron family estate. The capital letters suggest authority and security, the distinguishing marks of a solid social enterprise. But immediately the engine of the car adds a warning note. It shuddered. The choice of the word shuddered is an example of Rebecca's extraordinary narrative precision. The Oxford English Dictionary offers a variety of definitions of the verb shudder. Quote, have a convulsive tremor of the body caused by fear, abhorrence, cold, etc. Quote, feel repugnance or horror in doing. Quote, vibrate or quiver. Rebecca uses the word in all 3 senses. The vibration of the engine is a tremor of fear, a feeling of horror at the outcome of the journey ahead, an omen. In his great work, 6 Memos for the Next Millennium, Italo Calvino suggests that, quote, the moment an object appears in a narrative, it is charged with a special force and becomes like the pole of a magnetic field, a knot in the network of invisible relationships. We might even say that in a narrative, any object is always magic. Rebecca's Citron family estate is an object of just this kind. Here, at the start, it is the magical means by which the plot is foretold. Later in the story, its breakdown may be read as a futile attempt to forestall the tale's predestined end. At the moment of breakdown, Rachel Slatter's father himself personifies the car. She's got the hiccups again, said Mr. Slatter. But his words are words alone, words without force, unentangled. The menace escapes him. The hiccups signify no more than a faulty engine. The metaphor is dead. It's not much, he assures his daughter, but by that time the reader may already have guessed that the car knows more than the car father imagines. The car is the first of many objects in this story to be charged with magic. Rachel Slatter, we learn, has left all her costume in the hall, where presumably the play is to be put on, all that is except for the ears. My ears, she calls them, as if they were already a part of her own body. Is it the presence of these ears which causes the car to shudder? They are the symbol of identity of the hare, the mark of the beast that Rachel is about to become. It may be significant, or it may be no more than a meaningful coincidence, that Harwell, the village where Rachel lived, used to be known as Harewell. In either case, Rebecca would probably have seen around the village at some time or other the symbol of a hare's head, dominated by huge ears, decorating a commemorative pamphlet, pot, or church window. The ears reveal the silent presence of the hare from the moment the action begins. Does the heroine already sense this presence? As Rachel Slatter steps into the family car, the narrator's tone of voice momentarily resembles Rachel's own, as if she is sharing rather than witnessing her plight. She was a bit nervous. At this point in the story, the reader is inclined to put Rachel's nervousness down to thoughts about the forthcoming performance, but the narrator has a deeper cause in mind. Later, when the heroine's nervousness is mentioned a second time halfway through the story, an attentive reader may begin to sense the truth at which the nervousness hints. By the end of the story, we will be led to suspect that the stiffness of Rachel's reply to her father's question here at the start is in part at least, the laboured response of a child whose metamorphosis has already begun. The narrator knows it and feels for her heroine even as she withholds the truth from her readers. "Right," said her dad, and the journey begins. That word "right" is heavy with irony, but it is an irony of which Mr. Slatter is unaware. All is not right, as Rachel's stiffness has hinted. The consciousness of the father is already at odds with that of his daughter. For Mr. Slatter, the journey is just another errand, one more aspect in a familiar routine. If his daughter is a little nervous, that is only to be expected, a single case of first-night nerves. Meanwhile, for Rachel, what is at stake is not a first night's performance, but consciousness itself. Father and daughter sit beside each other, lost in their own thoughts. The word "right" signals nothing but trouble ahead. As the journey advances, the narrative quickens. A rapid succession of verbs sets the pace. Let roll, swung round, drove, sped past, accelerated, went round, headed. Familiar landmarks pass by in close order. The drive, the junction, the White Hart, the Grove Road, Rostock, the roundabout Wantage. The story's geography is as exact as its history. This is the very way in which Rebecca herself would have driven to Wantage many a time. Basically, real memory again serves her well. Enumerating each landmark in turn becomes the indispensable means of establishing the authenticity of the tale, the spatial equivalent of the recorded date. And then, suddenly, within sight of the ostensible goal, the journey, the narrative, reality itself, all these are interrupted and overturned. They were nearly at Wantage when the car started hiccuping. The apparently simple sentence bears close examination. Of all the sentences in the story, it is the only one that contains a subordinate clause. Incidentally, and as an aside, that would mean that if she submitted this story for our standards test, taken at the age of 11, it would fail to get a high mark because there was only one sentence with a subordinate clause in it. It tells us something about the standards that the authorities are setting. So it is that Rebecca halts the narrative in full flow, bringing her tale to rest on the image of hiccuping. Mr. Slatter's comment, "she's got the hiccups again," picks up the narrator's word but misconstrues it. For the character in the story, hiccuping implies merely a temporary setback. For the storyteller, it prefigures the metamorphosis to come, a seismic disturbance of space and time. The great spurt of steam that came up from the car bonnet continues the narrative imagery, though still Mr. Slatter cannot read its meaning. "It's not much," is all he will say in answer to Rachel's cry. "We have reached the parting of the ways." They have stopped in a lay-by in a space between worlds. The narrative, like the journey, is momentarily suspended. What follows is a conversation between father and daughter in which the outcome of the story is determined. It is presented as a confrontation between future and past, between the daughter whose mind is absorbed in what is to come, and the father who looks back complacently to the world that his daughter is about to leave behind. Rachel's opening cry, "I can't be late," brings to mind the opening page of Alice in Wonderland, when suddenly the white rabbit runs by, saying to herself, oh dear, I shall be late." We remember being told at the start of the story that Rachel Slatter was going to be in a play called Alice, and at once the narrator recalls the ears that Rachel had with her in the car. She fingered her felt ears nervously. When Rachel got in the car, replying stiffly to her father's question, she was already, as the narrator sympathetically put it, a bit nervous. Now the nervousness deepens. Fingered, like shuddered, calls forth a multitude of interpretations. A reader is immediately struck by the power of the word in its particular context, and once again a glance at the dictionary confirms and enlarges its resonance. To finger means, among other things, quoting the dictionary again, to point at with the fingers, to play on a musical instrument with the fingers, to hold or turn upon the fingers, to make restless movements with the fingers. Each of these meanings finds an echo in Rebecca's melodic alliterative sentence. The ears are of felt, but they are also felt in the restless fingers, as a musical score might be felt, the significance of which Rachel Slatter could as yet barely anticipate. Rachel's nervous cry makes no impact on her father, almost as if he had not heard it, as indeed in its full significance he had not. His mind is focused not on the visionary end that Rachel already senses, however dimly, but on the world left behind in Harwell, that uncomfortably familiar world of every day. "It's not much," is all he can find to say, "but I'll have to phone up Pete to tow us back." The telephone is the magical object that binds Mr. Slatter to the past. It links him back to Harwell, not forward to Wantage. Or is it just that Mr. Slatter cannot imagine forewarning Wantage that his daughter is going to be late? Perhaps it makes no difference, for the telephone is itself a part of the past, no longer close at hand, but in Ardington, a village which the car has already sped by on its journey, as Rebecca's local readership would surely have known. No wonder that she becomes desperate. "But Arlington's 4 miles back," Rachel shouted, "and I've got a play to put on." There is, of course, a hidden meaning to be found in those last few words, which the narrator is about to reveal, but at this point in the story, it is the shouting that commands the reader's attention. It is followed at once by silence, and within that silence, the fate of father and daughter, and of their story, are sealed. Her father thought for a moment. 5 minutes later, he had gone to find a telephone. Every reader who attempts to read Rebecca's story aloud feels the need to mark in some way, whether by a change of voice, a slight pause, or a slower pace, the chasm that yawns between these two sentences. The distance between full stop and capital letter becomes the literary expression of a very particular moment, the moment of decision in which the drama of the plot is resolved. Once the boundary between one sentence and the next has been crossed, there can only be one end to the story. Father and daughter are lost to each other. Whether or not they know it, their worlds have separated. Rebecca marks this separation by means of the past perfect tense. 5 minutes later, he had gone to find a telephone. By the time he returns, it will be too late. For all his efforts, there will be no going back. The story resumes apparently seamlessly, yet the missing 5 minutes represent the space of a lifetime. The effect that Rebecca achieves here is of a kind of narrative caesura. Until this moment, Mr. Slatter and his daughter have travelled, however uneasily, together. Now they must journey on alone. The narrative is about to unwind. Reading the story, we sense that this is the climax, the turning point of the plot. We await the denouement uneasily. The father's desertion of his daughter at her moment of greatest need signifies the commencement of the metamorphosis for which, from the beginning of the story, the narrative has scrupulously prepared us. Rachel began to walk towards Wantage, we are told, and with these words we enter the story's dazzling finale. Wantage may be the heroine's destination, but it is not given to her to reach it. In language of exceptional subtlety, Rebecca gently draws her heroine towards her fantastic destiny, action by action, thought by thought, sensation by sensation. She put on her felt ears. We have known about these ears from the opening of the story, my ears, as Rachel called them then, ears which she later fingered nervously in her lap. Now at last she chooses to wear them. It is a momentous choice. The words "put on" remind us of what she has just before shouted at her father, "and I've got a play to put on." But the words mean more now than we might expect. It is no longer an actor's role that Rachel is about to assume, but a new identity. Putting on the ears is the first step in her transformation. She is to become what she has chosen to play. She sucked the travelling suite hungrily. Once again, as in dodecahedron, the journey into another world is accompanied by hunger. And as she sucks the travelling suite, Rachel ponders her fate. I wonder if they'll miss me, Rachel thought. After all, I am only the March Hare, capital M, capital H, incidentally. The words are apparently addressed to her fellow actors, emphasising the insignificance of her part in the forthcoming play. But in the light of what follows, they seem to have a deeper meaning. Is it her father, her family, her friends whom she has in mind? Is it her own significance that puzzles her, the girl who is about to be changed into the March Hare, no less, but after all, only a hare, no more? There is a note of sadness and resignation in her words, which the story's conclusion will both confirm and complicate. The 7 short sentences that follow Rachel's musings take us into the very moment of metamorphosis itself. Here is the entire passage once again. Her nose began to itch. She twitched it. Her hands and feet tingled slightly, probably with cold. Rachel was still hungry. She picked some grass and chewed it thoughtfully. Her glassy eyes shone with the moon reflection. Her furry paws glistened with the dew of evening. The magic of Rebecca's narrative at this, the climax of her tale, is the literary equivalent of the magic of metamorphosis itself. It is not until the final sentence that we can be sure of the outcome, so unobtrusively calculated is Rebecca's language. In this respect, it would not seem extravagant to compare Rebecca's achievement with that of the great storytellers within the Western tradition, rather as Tolstoy compares Piedka's writing to the writing of Goethe. Here, for example, is how Calvino describes the poetic achievement of Ovid in his Metamorphoses. Quote, "It is in following the continuity of the passage from one form to another that Ovid displays his incomparable gifts. He tells how a woman realizes that she is changing into a lotus tree. Her feet are rooted to the earth. A soft bark creeps up little by little and enfolds her groin. She makes a movement to her hair and finds her hands full of leaves." Or he speaks of Arachne's fingers, expert at winding and unravelling wool, turning the spindle, plying the needle in embroidery, fingers that at a certain point we see lengthening into slender spider's legs and beginning to weave a web. Unquote. Rebecca's deceptively simple language has a comparable effect for all her tender years. We are told how Rachel twitched her nose, a word which suggests the involuntary or instinctive movements of a small animal, and much more evocative in this context than the more predictable scratched. Her hands and feet tingled slightly, the narrative continues, picking up the soft insistence in sound and sense of itch and twitched. Probably with cold, the narrative seeks to reassure us, but behind the word probably lies the darker possibility which already by now her heroine has begun to sense. Hunger assails her again as she contemplates the future, but it is no longer a manufactured travelling suite, but the grass across which she is walking that she picks and chews, quote, thoughtfully. Thoughtfully strengthens the hint conveyed by the word probably, suggesting that by now the wandering child has understood what is happening to her, and the next sentence confirms the truth. The glassy eyes are the eyes of an animal she has become, eyes in which her new world is reflected, the world of the moonlight purple and silver, which Rebecca cites in her letter as the image out of which her story arose. It is as if the moon has entered through Rachel's eyes and taken her over, the very opposite of Alice's predicament in Alice Through the Looking Glass. And now, for the first time, the hare can make its candid appearance. Her furry paws glistened with the dew of evening. Taken together, these final 2 sentences form a couplet which draws the metamorphosis to its haunting end. The paws are the final unmistakable mark of the beast. The passage from one world to another is complete, and it would seem that there is no way back. Far away Mr. Slatter returned. This carefully ordered sentence evokes nostalgia, a sense of loss, of a world left behind irretrievably. It's not as if the father on his return is that remote from the daughter, if only he knew. She is there right in front of him, and yet she is no longer close at hand. The perspective from which the words far away are written is that of the narrator, who knows the truth that escapes the shadowy Mr. Slatter. His daughter has fled fled from the world into which she has vanished. His daughter has fled. It is from the world into which she has vanished that his own seems far away, no more perhaps already than a distant memory. All that Mr. Slatter sees is a hare jumping away on the grassy bank. He has not even noticed that his daughter has gone. We are told that he catches sight of her, of the hare, in the light of the moon, that self-same moon which shines in the daughter's new eyes, but for the father the moonlight is deceptive. He fails to read its hidden meaning. He only seems to see. Or rather, he cannot see beyond appearances. The hare he catches sight of is no more than the familiar creature of the downlands, as is clear from the narrator's switch for the first and only time from the pronoun she to it. It leapt over the hedge and scampered on the cornfield. The implications of that astonishing leap lie outside his comprehension. The title of the story has a proverbial source, as we have seen, and now the story closes on another proverb. Mr. Slatter shook his head and smiled, as mad as a March hare, he thought. The traditional words are preserved this time, but their significance is dramatically reconstructed. For Mr. Slatter, the proverb is a conventional trope, a pretty turn of phrase suggested by the creature he has just caught sight of. Meanwhile, the truth, unknown to him, is that his daughter has become the proverb's subject. Rebecca establishes this bitter contrast through a simple, barely noticeable grammatical device. Within the proverb as pondered by Mr. Slatter, the words March hare are written in lower case. A few sentences earlier, the same words as spoken by Rachel were capitalized. After all, I'm only the March hare. Such are the delicate means by which Rebecca makes an old proverb assume a new and startling life. But who is mad? Who is it who is mad? The daughter, who has leapt into the beyond, into the world of her own imagination, or the father, who is too worldly to notice what is happening to his daughter? Characteristically, the story leaves it to the reader to decide. The end is mysterious as it was in Dodecahedron. In the earlier story, Rebecca acknowledges a return from the world beneath the waves, but conceals its meaning. In this, her ultimate valedictory tale, she leaves her heroine alone within her new world, scampering across the cornfield into which she has leapt, while her father looks on without suspicion, wrapped up in his own thought. He thought, are the story's last words, as if the narrator is prodding her readers to speculate and interpret in their turn. Terrified or thrilled, we are at the end left wondering. Underneath the last line of her manuscript, at the bottom of the page, Rebecca has written her own name, Rebecca Smalley. The Y of Smalley extended below and across the rest of the surname in a brief flourish. As far as I know, it was the only time that she ever chose to write her name at the bottom of her story. It is as if she is signing off as she reaches the end of her life at primary school, which also marks in so many ways the end of childhood. Or is it only a final assertion of her own narrative authority, even her own identity, in the face of this passionate and fearful tale of escape and rebellion, the story of a child turned into a hare, enchanted by her own imagination? I've taken up too long with this interpretation, though it's the heart of what I want to say, so I will try and reduce what I have to say now to 5 minutes at most. But I must say something very briefly about pedagogy, to which all this story has been leading. Creative consciousness, or the imagination if you prefer, seems to me, as it seemed to Tolstoy, to be absolutely central to every learning, every kind of education which is worthy of the name. As Steve replied at the beginning, I see children as thinkers, whether in art, literature, philosophy, history, science, mathematics, whatever the subject, where imaginative thought deserves to be whose imaginative thought deserves to be taken seriously, both for what it tells us about our own lives, as Tolstoy saw, and also what it tells us about learning in general and individually. Taking children's work seriously means practicing the art of interpretation. And I see the art of interpretation, as I've been trying to practice it in what I've read to you, as the teacher's central task. This is where I want to refer to a quotation, just a brief sentence from one of the letters of John Keats, who writes, We read fine things, but never feel them to the full until we have gone the same steps as the author. We read fine things, but never feel them to the full until we have gone the same steps as the author. I want to try and say what I understand that sentence to mean in the light of children's learning. I believe that the task of interpretation demands first and foremost living in the world of the work, drawing out its full intention, trying to inhabit the space that it provides for us, as I've been trying to do with Rebecca's story. That's a task which is extremely time-consuming and extremely difficult, but without which, in my view, no decent education can hope to proceed. So the first task is to live within the world of the work. The second task, and I see that as a task of recreating the author's, if you like, recreating the author's intention, though there are problems with the word intention, which I don't want to go into. The second task of interpretation is a task of questioning, responding, criticizing the work, and representing one's questions, one's responses, one's critique to the student whose work it is. This is a task which has to be performed by a group rather than by a single individual. It's a task which I see not as the task of the teacher facing one particular child, but as the classroom itself, all the children working together with the teacher in responding to a child's work, responding to it in terms of how they read it, asking questions about it, and to some extent also critiquing it, questions which might cast doubts on some of the story's purposes or intentions or techniques. And I see that as the task of representing. So the first task, living in the world of the work, I see as a means of recreating the world expressed by the work. Questioning, responding, criticizing, I see as an act of representing one's own response to the student. And then there's the third task, which is looking ahead, which I think is a matter of putting all our knowledge, skill and authority as teachers, our expertise, at the service of a child's developing imagination. And I see that as the task of reconstruction. Learning, as properly seen, I think, seems to me to be a business of gradually, through the development of one's own imagination, in response to and with the help of one's teachers, is a job of reconstructing the world such as we know it, so that it somehow makes sense to one's own particular experience and one's own particular skill. I believe that successful education is invariably a matter of reconstruction. As for the present agenda in schools, I'm thinking in particular of my own country, but I'm pretty sure it's the same, if not worse, in yours. You will have seen already that I have nothing to say about standards, tests, targets, and levels of attainment. The world of standards means nothing for the kind of education which I'm talking about. That's to say that it's impossible to make sense of children's literary imagination, Rebecca's story, in terms of giving it a mark, assigning it to it a level, thinking about it in terms of a test. It only makes sense to one as long as you start to enter into its world, describe it, interpret it, and see how it relates to your own artistic and intellectual experience. So what at the present we're confronted with, certainly in my country, is a system of education which, although it doesn't wish to and pretends it doesn't, actually denies the relevance of imagination to the child's developing mind. But I refuse to be dismayed by this. I attended a conference a few days ago where everyone who spoke was incredibly pessimistic about the world, and someone suddenly said, "But I remain an optimist." I thought, for God's sake, why? Nothing that you've said gives cause for optimism. But I think there is, as far as education is concerned, a cause for great optimism, which is simply this, that when you get in front of a class of children and start to teach them, and I'm sure this is true at high school as well as at elementary school, then before you know it, the world has changed completely, and the children's ideas have inspired you in a way that no test or no level or no target can ever hope to represent. And that's what I want to leave you with now.
Can I start?
I thought you probably would.
Is it okay if I start? I was wondering a number of things, but I was wondering whether you ever feel or worry that in your work of interpretation, which you defined as living in the world of the work, do you ever have a sense that you've gone too far, or that you have a boundary which you won't cross? You spoke very briefly before you read the story, about having some resistance or hesitation about psychologizing, and so I'm wondering what guides you, what is when you're interpreting.
It's a very hard question to answer. Within the classroom context, it's partly controlled by talking to the child about their work, but you don't always have time to do that with any particular individual piece. I tend to resist interpretations which are obviously beyond anything that a child could possibly have thought of. Not that they could have been conscious of, because I think it's important not to define the word intention so strictly that in order to have an intention you have to be able to express in words exactly what it is. Children have many intentions which are clear from the work that they write, even though they wouldn't be able to put it in the same terminology using the same words that I would put it in. So there is a control. I tend to resist interpretations which go way beyond what I imagine, I suppose, a child could possibly have understood. But I think the danger is much more strongly the other way round, of underinterpretation. You often interpret a child's work and people will say, I can't believe that he ever would have meant that. That seems to me to be a very dangerous remark to make. I see the sensible position is the other way round, saying, if this meaning can be got out of the work, why shouldn't I assume that is what the child intended to be in the work? I'd need to have evidence that they didn't intend that at all. Sometimes they don't. I mean, sometimes you'll read a child's work and give them an explanation of how you understand it, and they'll say, but I didn't mean that at all, and tell you something completely different. Even then, sometimes you feel that they're wrong and you're right. I don't want to be too pompous about this, but after all, I think it was Charlotte Bronte, or else it was John Updike. It seems an unlikely combination. Or one or the other, who said, I only know what I meant when I read what I've written. And it seems to me that intention is a fidgety word to talk about. But I don't want to, I think it's very important that to see the child's work as intentional, in the sense that they mean what they say. And if this is the meaning that you can get out of it, you'd need evidence that somehow they couldn't possibly have meant that. I would very clearly argue that everything I said about Rebecca's work could be justified in terms of her intent. I don't think there's anything there that I feel convinced was not anything she could possibly have intended, even though she wouldn't have quoted Ovid's Metamorphosis or Benjamin's The Storyteller or even Tolstoy in her explanation. And you can see from what she wrote at the age of 15 that she was fully aware at that stage of what it was that she'd been up to. That's why I read her letter first.
Other questions or thoughts?
How important is background knowledge about the child to these interpretations? Like you mentioned how her father had a son and things like that. And when you're analyzing these works, how important is that?
Normally, I'd say not important. In this particular case, it seemed important because of this strong contrast between the workaday real world and the magical world that she enters. But I think that one needn't have known any of that to have got the point. Indeed, for example, the date, Saturday, June the 13th. It's only last year, it's probably 12 years, maybe more, since Rebecca wrote her story. And I've been looking at it for a long time during that period of time. But it was only last year when I was actually writing this part of my book that I realized that Saturday, June the 13th was a real date. There was a Saturday, June the 13th on the very year that Rebecca wrote the story. I'd already made up my mind about what that meant. But it sort of gave it, as it were, added significance. So it was useful, but not essential. And in general, in most of the interpretations I offer in the book, which discusses work of children from, not just from my own school, but also children from a school here in Chicago, because one of the chapters deals with Vivian Paley's work. I try to avoid any assumptions about the knowledge of the children's backgrounds.
I was interested also in what Steve was saying before about conscious intention versus unconscious intention, and whether when you're talking about the work with the students, if they, some of the things that they may have intended unconsciously, and when you bring those to light, in a sophisticated way, both helps them grow as writers and both confuses them sometimes.
Yes. I think the contrast between helps them to grow and confuses them, it's very, very important. I jib slightly at well, I don't jib at it, but I would want to question the word unconscious intention. There are unconscious intentions which might be explored by psychoanalysts or people of that kind, and those have, although it's not that they have no interest to me, but I absolutely avoid those in my own thinking, because I think they're extremely dangerous, and also because I'm not an expert in that particular field and have nothing valuable, I think, to say about it. But there's another kind of intention which isn't I think, unconscious, but in this sense, that the children intend what they say. They mean to say just that. And they've used words, as you can see in Rebecca's case, which have a very clear meaning and which resist certain sort of attempts of anyone who might say, oh, well, that's just accidental. They're determined to keep the words as she is when she said 5 minutes later he had gone to find the telephone in Wantage. I'm certain from other things that I've read that Rebecca was absolutely determined to make that great gap there. But she wouldn't necessarily, at that time, if I'd spoken to her about it, she wouldn't necessarily have agreed with me that that's what she was doing. She might have thought that what I was saying was something rather pompous and sort of teacherly. There's a real problem there. So in responding to her work, I would certainly feel free to mention the sort of things that I read in it, and to allow her to make up her own mind whether they were helpful or not, whether they made sense or not. What you often find is, I've often found in my experience, is that a child may say, oh, that's just Mr. Armstrong rabbiting on, as he usually does, about how wonderful my work is, and thinking nothing of it, and then say 2 or 3 months later you look at something else they've done and realise that they've taken quite seriously what you had to say. Similarly with discussion that takes place within the class. I don't think we should be frightened of revealing to children what we think about their work, even if it goes beyond what they might be able to say themselves, as long as it's done in a certain way. I mean, to give you an example, one of the other stories discussed in my book is a picture story written by a 6-year-old child. And there's a point in the story where I felt certain that the child had changed from the third-person tense to the first-person tense. The story was about a little girl who got lost, and it's all in the third person until the little girl is found. And then she suddenly says, and when we got home we had tea. And I said to her, Melissa, why did you change from she to we at this point? Because I'd already got a grand theory, which if you read my book, you'll find out about why she'd done that. Why did you change from she to we? And all she said was, oh dear, I shouldn't have done. No, I realise now. And she was certain I was making some direct criticism of her work. When she read the book aloud, the story aloud, she actually tried to shift it to she again, and then, or they rather, and then went back to we again. So she wasn't prepared to recognise that there was a sort of deliberate intent in doing that. So there you're on the borderlines of an unconscious intention. And yet I think in her mind it's quite clear that she was able to shift from they, she, he, to we, only at the point when the girl had been saved and was no longer lost. So she could be secure. And one comes across those sorts of delicacy borderlines all the time.
one more.
You mentioned Tolstoy, and I was wondering whether you would be willing to share a little bit more about other inspirations, large inspirations in your own work. And in particular, I'm thinking about the tension between the questions of literary analysis and more of what one might talk about as a social science perspective, which is suggested also and closely observed children even by the title. And also I'm thinking of your remarks on Goethe in Barbara Engel's interview with you some years ago. Yes? Oh, I'm sorry. You know, in terms of attending to the world, which obviously was something that you thought a good deal about also.
Yes. It would be hard to say exactly. I've been influenced. I was influenced a great deal at the end of the 60s and the beginning of the 70s by the work of some American thinkers, in particular a guy called David Hawkins, who's a professor of philosophy in Colorado, whose work had an immense influence on me. And indeed by Brenda herself, who I first met at that time. And those people introduced me to a range of thinkers whom I knew nothing about. For example, the work of Patricia Carini over here was very influential. And that was interesting in the sense because the influence then was slightly different. I remember reading Patricia Carini's work for the first time, I think on the suggestion of Brenda Engel, and being surprised to find that there was someone who'd been thinking exactly the same as I had, but from a very different perspective, from the perspective of phenomenology and academic psychology, rather than from the sort of teacher-like perspective I was using. So that was one group of people. More recently, the biggest influences on me have been not educationalists at all, but writers of one kind or another. So it's not an easy question to answer. I don't think there are too many people who've written too much about the kind of things that I've been talking about this afternoon. It's when people ask you who your influences are, and you look around and think, it's not easy to think of too many folks. But there are some over here and a few in England as well. I'm still very influenced by the work of John Dewey. I think that Dewey is a deeply unrespected figure in academic circles today, and I think that's a tremendous mistake, great error. And some of Dewey's work still seems to me to be wonderfully suggestive for thinking about children's learning, particularly as it happens, not one of his books on education, but the book Art as Experience, which I think is an extraordinary book and has many things that are useful for us as teachers.
Michael, I want to thank you again